That's just part of the thing. That's just part of what we try to do to, make it a partnership, not just a one-way deal where you refer work to us. So one thing I can tell you guys for sure is that these taxes keep changing and they keep getting added way more than what they used to. So since 2016, there's been a whole bunch of new taxes that keep getting piled on, and there seems every time you turn around, there's another one, and they overlap. So some of the taxes, like for example, City of Vancouver has the empty homes tax. It has the BC speculation and vacancy tax. It has the federal anti-flipping tax. It will have the BC anti-flipping tax, and that's all in the same city. And it's sort of like, okay, can you add more? And actually, there's a federal underutilized housing tax as well, which would also apply there. So it seems the governments do not care whether there is already a piece of legislation in there that's dealing with what they think should be changed. They just throw another one on. Say, well, this is different. The definitions are different. The rules are different. Sometimes the amount of tax is different, but now you have to deal with two of them instead of one, or in this case of Vancouver, 3 or 4. And it doesn't seem to be any sign of abating. So this is just, this is something just to make your life more difficult as a realtor, because you're out there trying to get deals. You're trying to get, you're trying to help someone buy a house or sell a house. But on top of it, these are like a bunch of landmines that are getting thrown in your way just to make life more interesting for you. And one thing I can tell you, we've hit our 32,000th file this year. Every surprise you guys come up with is a bad one. Like if your client doesn't know already what the issue is and they find out about it later, it's almost a certainty it's going to be a bad surprise. So the thing is, well, these points of just bringing stuff to your attention is just to say, well, okay, we can maybe avoid a surprise, or at least bring it to your client's attention so they say, okay, I can live with it, or let's find a different property or write a different offer. So basically, and actually, it's funny, Angelica sent me a copy of a due diligence checklist that I made up for you guys back in 2016, and then we updated it in 2020. That's the one she sent me the other day. And so I think I'll just rejig that again and update it for 2024. And then maybe we could talk about that one next time, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. And usually these things are good for 7 or 8 years. Now it just seems 4 years. There's a lot of changes. So some of these things for you guys to be careful about when somebody comes to you and says, okay, I want to buy a house. Usually the first thing I would say before is, check the title. Let's see what kind of house we're going to write an offer on. But even before you get to that point now, guys, you have to say, well, are you a citizen of Canada or are you a permanent resident? Because if you're not, guess what? You probably can't buy the property. Now, there are some exceptions to the federal foreign buyers ban. If you remember, Trudeau put that in a couple of years ago, and then just because there's an election coming up federally next year, he's extended it to 2027. So for the areas you guys deal with, which is going to be mostly Metro Vancouver, that's covered by the federal anti-foreign buyers ban. It's got a fancy label for the actual act, but it's essentially saying if you're a foreigner, you can't buy residential property in Canada, not just British Columbia. But again, this applies certainly to British Columbia. So that one's a big one, because there are a lot of people here under various circumstances. They could be temporary students, they could be foreign workers, they could be thinking of moving to Canada or moving back to Canada. And so the question, if they say, yes, I'm a Canadian citizen, I'm a permanent resident, you're fine. Just carry on to step 2. But if they say they're not, or one of them is not, because a lot of times it's a couple buying, then you have to sort of look into it and say, okay, what are the ramifications? Can you buy or can you not buy? So one thing we run into a lot this last couple of years is a couple coming along, and one of them is a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, and the other one isn't. And if they're married or common law, they're exempt. They can buy. Okay, so that's in an interesting situation, because it's, oh, good, we're fine. Let's go ahead and put an offer on something. But that's not necessarily the end of the picture, because this foreign buyers ban is a federal piece of legislation. It has got nothing to do with the BC foreign buyer's tax, which is called additional tax. It's really part of the property transfer tax, but it's a separate area. And that's the 20% tax. If you recall, Christy Clark put that into effect in 2016. It was 15%. Now it's 20%. So the question then becomes, if a couple is going to buy the property and she is not a Canadian or a permanent resident and he is, what share of the property is she going to buy? As you guys all undoubtedly know, when there's two people buying a piece of property, you can either be a joint tenant or you can be a tenant in common. And a joint tenant means you have the same interest. It's 50-50 with a right of survivorship if one of you dies. A tenant in common, however, is a situation where you can be anything. You can be 50-50, you can be 90-10, you can be 99-1, and it's entirely up to the individual buyers. Now, that was the case for many years up to 2016. Quite often you would have, for example, one person is a first-time buyer. There is a first-time buyer exemption, you probably already know, in BC, and the other person was not a first-time buyer. So most lawyers and notaries would say, okay, we'll put you on for 99% and we'll put you on for 1%. And essentially the first-time buyer exemption basically takes away 99% of the tax. And so for the case of a foreign buyer and his wife or husband, that's not something you can just do, because the government has got something called a piece of legislation inside of the act. I'm sorry, a section in the act called anti-avoidance rules. Okay, so in other words, if you're doing something when you're purchasing a piece of property for the sole reason of avoiding tax, that is a no-no. You can be charged double tax. You can get all sorts of penalties for doing that. So the fact of the matter is, a big red flag for the BC government, when you file a property transfer tax return, I don't know if any of you have seen those lately, but they've gotten bigger and bigger. They used to be 2 pages. Now they're 7 pages worth of data that's going to the government when you purchase a piece of property. And one of those pages says, okay, are you a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident? And if you put down the husband as a permanent resident and he's getting 99% and the wife is neither, and she's getting 1%, that is a huge red flag that goes to the government, and they will almost certainly audit that file. And they will say to you, okay, why are you going 99% and why are you going 1%, as if it's any of their business, but they make it their business now. So you actually have to have a business case to say why that has been done. Okay, because if you don't, you risk them overturning that and charging you under this anti-avoidance provision and paying a huge penalty and paying this 20% on some amount of the purchase price, not the 1%. So in a sense, we had one of these recently where we of course, whenever we see something like this, we have to talk to the client and say, okay, well, what do you want to do here? And what is your reason? If you're not going to go equal ownership, what is the reason you're not? Now, once in a while, there is an actual reason. For example, maybe the wife is buying and it's her money and she just needs the husband to qualify. So the gentleman who's the mortgage broker here would say, okay, well, we will put him on the title for 1%, because if he's not on the title, we can't use his income. So that's the reason he's going on for 1%. He's the non-Canadian. That's a reasonable argument. So I think that would probably fly. It's not a certainty, but at least it's a position that you can take when the government almost certainly audits your file. We've had other cases where someone just recently got married, and again, it's the same thing. The husband's putting in most of the money, the wife's put a little bit of money. They've only been married a month. He's not that comfortable with her going on the title for 50%. So again, if there's a reason, if there's a legitimate reason to do this, fine. Go ahead, roll the dice, and you'd probably be okay. If you have no reason whatsoever, and you're simply saying, well, I don't want to pay the extra tax, that's a big mistake. So this is a situation where you're jumping the hurdle for the foreign buyers ban, but you're getting caught by the foreign buyers tax. One's federal, one's provincial. So you have to actually look at both. And the same thing can be the case where someone has got there are exemptions to the foreign buyers ban. As you probably know, there's some exemptions for temporary students. There's some exemptions if you have a work permit. So someone has a work permit and they say, oh, great, I have a work permit. I can come and buy a property in BC. I jump through the hoop for the foreign buyers ban, and you're still caught by the BC foreign buyers tax, because the only exemption for that one is something called the BC Provincial Nominee Program. Okay, so if you have if you're accepted under that program and you're not a Canadian citizen, you're not a permanent resident, you're fine. You don't pay the extra tax. But that doesn't mean you automatically get in because you're under some other program in the federal government. So again, it's like a minefield where you go, okay, well, I'm through this one, but now I'm caught on another one. And again, that's a very unpleasant surprise, finding out that you're going to pay 20% on top of the property transfer tax that you thought you were going to pay, which is the 1% or the 2%. And we did have a case last year where some fellow fell into that exact point. He bought the property. There was still subject conditions. So fortunately, he gave us a call and he said, okay, here's the situation. I said, well, you know you're going to be paying this 20%. And he said, no. I was told by my broker, my realtor, whatever, says, no, I'm exempt from the foreign buyers ban. I say, you are, but you're going to get stuck paying 20% on this $1 million property. So that's 200 grand on top of the $18,000 property transfer tax you thought you were going to pay. So of course he terminated the deal, rightly so. But the point is, again, when you're not sure, the whole point of this is not so you can go out and memorize these things. It's just to know there is this piece of federal legislation saying you can't buy, but even if you can buy, you may still get caught if you are not a permanent resident or Canadian citizen for BC purposes. So one is for federal, one is for provincial. And as Doug said, many of these things do not exist in other provinces. So you wouldn't have these foreign buyers taxes and whatnot in Alberta, but you do have them here. So we have more and more here. So this federal buyers ban, it's kind of an interesting one because it's restricted to residential properties. So it's a residential property with 3 dwellings or less. So if you bought a fourplex, for example, you're exempt. If you bought a commercial building, you're exempt. If you buy vacant land, you're exempt. If you're outside of so they call it a census metropolitan area, which means there's 100,000 population, or something called a census agglomeration area, which is a concentrated 10,000 population. If you buy outside of those areas, you're exempt. And again, there's a CMHC website. I'll send you the link, Doug, that they've got. You can just fill in the address and they'll tell you if you've popped into one of these areas. But for you guys listening, I'm assuming you probably mostly sell Metro Vancouver. Those areas are covered. You don't need to bother checking. You can be exempt if you're buying a property to develop it. You can be exempt if you bought the property before January last year. So let's say you bought a pre-sale 2 years ago and it's coming up for sale now or purchase now, you're exempt from the foreign buyers ban on that. As I say, you can be exempt if your partner is a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. And there's a question that's come up for a number of times from realtors that we've dealt with and said, well, could a person make an offer on a place if they're not a permanent resident yet, but they think they're going to be one before the closing date? So you put a subject condition into the contract saying, well, subject to the buyer getting his PR status before the closing date, could you make that offer? And there's a bit of a, real estate lawyers, if you ask 10 of them, 5 of them will say yes, and 5 of them will say no. And so if you read the regulations to this foreign buyers ban legislation, you could probably write the contract in such a way that you'd be okay by basically putting in some extra wording. But bottom line is then, yeah, you'd put, if you're going to do that, you put a couple of extra clauses in the contract, and of course make it a subject condition, because if you go ahead and buy the place and you're not at least a permanent resident, you're going to get hit with a $10,000 fine, and you, the realtor, are also going to get hit with a $10,000 fine, and probably the lawyer is going to get hit with a $10,000 fine. So it's not a question that you know, if you're aware the guy's neither a citizen nor a permanent resident, you want to make sure he is or she is by the time you close. So that's one, again, to sort of keep these two pieces of legislation in mind together. They sort of function together. And there is something to be concerned about there. BC foreign buyers tax does not apply everywhere in BC, but it applies most places. And as I say, for you guys, it'll definitely apply to where you're selling or buying. Here's an interesting thing that you can do if people want to roll the dice and pay the tax in the first place. We have a couple right now that did this. She paid $56,000 foreign buyers tax, and she was not a permanent resident at the time, but she became a permanent resident within 1 year of closing. So if you want to roll the dice and say, we're pretty close, I'm very confident I'll get my PR within a year, you can apply to get it back. Okay, so as long as you become a PR within a year of closing and you make an application to get your money back within 6 months after that, and you meet all these other criteria and that you've moved into the property and on and on and on, then the government will actually issue a check and give you the money back. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you miss that deadline by a couple of days or a week, too bad. So you get your PR 390 days after you bought. Well, tough luck, the money's down the drain. So we're finding it quite interesting that the government, it's like the money is glued to their fingers instead of just saying, well, here's the application, we made it. And they're putting the clients through all kinds of hoops. Like you're saying, like, where did the money come from? Like we already asked them where the money come from. We already know where the money comes from. But so they're putting them through a lot of hoops, and my client's kind of saying, like, are we really going to get this money back? I said, well, I think you are, but they're certainly not making it easy. So they like to take your money, but they don't necessarily like to give it back. A couple of other things, again, just more stuff. You guys all aware this year, the BC government introduced the first-time buyers exemption has gone up. I mean, the first-time buyers exemption for property transfer tax in BC has been pretty much zero for the last 10 years. I mean, it was $500,000 and it phased out, I believe, at $525,000, and there's literally nothing available for that price. So under some pressure, and we'd actually written the government several times saying, well, when are you ever going to change this? And they, even as late as last year, they said, we're never going to change it. So again, maybe with an election coming up, they had a change of heart. So the new exemption's $830,000 for a first-time buyer. And it can actually go up to $860,000. It's a sort of sliding scale, it goes down. But what a lot of people still don't understand is it's not fully exempt up to that price. It's fully exempt up to $500,000, and you're still going to pay 2% property transfer tax on every penny over $500,000. So it's definitely a saving, but it's not a complete saving because the $500,000, that's eight grand worth of property transfer tax off the top, but you're still going to pay the difference. So that's something. Again, you don't want to tell your client you're buying a $650,000 property, you're exempt. No, you're not exempt. You're mostly exempt, but not quite. And again, once you get over the 830, it keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and 860, it's gone to zero. Now, having said that, again, it's still the same conditions. And again, because people have not worried about a first-time buyer's exemption literally for years, because it was non-existent, the person still has to jump through quite a few hoops in order to get that first-time buyer's exemption at $700,000 or $800,000. They have to be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. So if they're not getting that. And again, they've already dealt with this foreign buyers stuff in advance of that. They have to have lived in BC for the last year. Okay, so let's say they moved to BC 6 months ago. It's not going to work. Or the other option is they filed 2 tax returns as a BC resident within the last 6 years. So even if they haven't lived here the last year, but 2 years ago they filed a BC tax return as a resident, 2 years before that they filed it as a resident, they will still be entitled to this first-time buyers exemption. They have to move into the property as their principal residence. So you do not get a first-time buyer exemption if you're buying an investment property. So even if you're buying it from a developer, there's a different exemption for that. So you might still end up not paying any tax on that, but it's something you have to live in the property for at least a year. If you move out during the year, you'll have to pay a partial amount of the tax back to the government. You have to move into the property within 92 days. So you can't just say, well, I'll move in whenever I feel like it. No, you have a 92-day window to do that. And again, there's a size restriction of 1.24 acres. I don't think you guys are going to run into any properties that are within this price range that are 1.24 acres in the Lower Mainland. And again, if you make a false declaration, this idea that they will say, have you owned a property before? And what they mean is, have you owned a property before that you lived in as a principal residence? You could say, well, I owned a revenue property, I owned a farm that I never lived on. Those, you're still a first-time buyer as far as BC government's concerned. If you, however, bought a property in, let's say, Alberta 20 years ago and you lived in it as your residence, you are not a first-time buyer. There's no time limit on that, unlike, say, CMHC maybe has 3 years or 5 years, and you turn into a first-time buyer again. But this one, you never turn into a first-time buyer if you've owned a property somewhere else. So again, that's just something to keep in mind. Sometimes the realtor will tell the client, you're a first-time buyer, you're good. You owned a property 20 years ago in Saskatchewan. Yeah, it's no big deal. Sorry about that. I'll just have to mute that. So yeah, just keep in mind that first-time buyer is first time anywhere in the world ever if you lived in the property. Okay, so otherwise you're not going to get that first-time buyer exemption. So if you tell the client they're exempt and we tell them they're not, again, that's one of those unpleasant surprise things where it is they're not going to be happy because they're going to have to come up with a bunch of money that they didn't think they did. So that's an important one.
Yeah, I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Are they still doing that thing where, so you got a spouse that's one is a first-time buyer and one isn't, and they do the 99 to 1 thing, or is that tax avoidance? I don't know.
Well, I mean, let me put it this way. That's a possibility with this anti-avoidance rule that I was talking about for the foreign buyers tax can still apply to just a partner and and two partners or two spouses going 99 and 1. It's probably not as likely they would audit your file if you're both Canadians or you're both permanent residents, but they could. See, this is, and we've pressed the property transfer tax department numerous times to say, what's your policy on this? And they just won't answer. They don't have any policy. They just don't want to put it in writing. Sometimes you'll get an agent on the phone that says, yeah, well, if it was just they were both Canadians, we wouldn't look at it. Some other ones go, no, we don't have a policy on that. We're not going to comment on that. For sure, they're going to take a hard look at it if one of you is a non-Canadian or a non-resident. But if you're just both two Canadians, one's a first-time buyer, one's not, you still run that risk unless there's a business reason for it. And again, my own personal opinion, it's none of your damn business, government. This is a couple. They can do whatever they want. But the government says, no, no, no. Why are they doing this? Why are they going 99 and 1? Because most couples go joint tenant. Okay, so if there's no reason, then it becomes more difficult unless you actually have a reason and that it makes sense.
Wasn't
So,
it joint tenants in 99-1? Sorry,
so,
is it joint tenant 99-1, or do you have
no, joint tenant has to be 50-50.
Okay, so they can't go joint tenants. It's got to be tenants in common then.
Yes.
Well, that's kind of scary because if one of them dies, it's not automatically goes to the other one then.
Correct.
So not a good thing for a couple.
No, it's not. Now, I suppose a few years later, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, they could always flip the title back to a joint tenancy. I wouldn't recommend doing that like the next year, but somewhere in the future, they could change it back. So yeah, I mean, what it is to me, it's just interfering with your right as a citizen, a couple, to do what you want. Okay, and again, if you are audited though, in the case of both Canadians, and let's say you both put in the same amount of money toward the down payment, and you're both going to contribute to the mortgage, and you're both going to contribute to the taxes and the insurance, And I ask you, okay, Doug, so why are you 99% and your wife's 1%? Because I'm auditing your file. What are you going to say?
I'm trying to save money, Ken.
No, that's not good, because that means you just got penalized and you were going to pay double the tax. So you see, that's just something the government, and because before 2016, this was an automatic thing. People used to do this all the time, the 99-1. But of course, the government is broke. So they are looking for more money. And this tax generates $3.5 billion a year in British Columbia. So this is a huge moneymaker for the government, and they're always looking for more ways to get more money. And as you know, the tax used to be 1% and 2%, and now it goes to 3%, and then it can go to 5%, and then it can go to 20% on top of that if you're not a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. So it's been a cash cow all these years, and it just keeps getting more and more onerous all the time. Excuse me. Elizabeth, I'm sorry, I'm right in the middle of something. Can I call you back? Thanks, bye. Sorry about that, guys. So yeah, you could do it, but I would probably suggest you don't.
Fair enough.
Not to forget GST as well, guys, because you guys still run into GST all the time. I hope you guys are using a GST clause when you write an offer, basically saying in that offer this purchase price includes GST if it's applicable. Because if you're not doing that, then if GST in fact does turn out to be payable, and it could, although it's less likely so now, but it could, your buyer is going to pay it. Okay, and then they're going to say, well, how come we're finding this out now, and we have to add 5% onto the purchase price, and how come nothing's in the contract saying that? Okay, so again, if you're buying, throw the clause in. Property, the price includes GST. If it's applicable, you're fine. If it turns out it's applicable, you've already paid it. If it's not applicable, then it's fine. You see because what happens if you look at your standard form contract around clause, I think it's around 11 or 12, it talks about the lawyers exchanging these GST certificates. But by then, the subject conditions are already gone. The financing's already in place. The deal's going to close in a couple of days. And now you get a GST form back from the other side saying, yeah, it's subject to tax. Oh, why is that? Well, they tell you why. Okay, so who pays that when it's not in the contract? The buyer. Okay, so you can always reverse it and do whatever you want in the contract. But this clause I always suggest you guys use does exactly that. It reverses it and says, well, if it turns out it's payable, because the seller is the one who knows whether the tax is payable or not you, the buyer. So what GST depends on, and you guys all know, if it's brand new property, you're going to pay GST. That's pretty well a given. That's no surprise to anybody. But in some other cases, if the property was used for a commercial purpose, such as short-term rentals, which again are getting shrunk down by the government, but there are still some cases like that. Or let's say you're buying something in Whistler where it's all short-term rentals, you're going to pay GST. And so that being the case, if you throw that clause into the contract and the other person writes a counteroffer and says, we cross it out, well, that's a big red flag. Because what that person is saying then is there's probably tax, or at least we don't know if there's tax. Well, if the seller doesn't know if there's tax, you sure don't know as a buyer. Okay, because the circumstances of why GST is payable or not, unless it's brand new, is what the seller's doing with the property, not what you plan to do with the property as a buyer. Okay, so you don't know that. You probably don't know the seller. You've never met the seller. Maybe you've gone through and done an inspection on the property. But beyond that, you have no idea what the person was doing with the property. Just like you don't know if the person is a Canadian resident or not until he checks that little box on the contract. So again, as I say, guys, just make sure that it's something that comes up, not a lot, but once in a while it does come up. It's one of these things we call an unpleasant surprise, which is any surprise. And then there's going to be somebody that's very, very unhappy. You'll have a very unhappy client. There still is a GST new housing rebate, believe it or not, although again, it's pretty well non-existent here, because it cuts off at $450,000. So there's really nothing brand new out there, almost nothing that you could buy for $450,000. So anyway, it's still there for rental properties, qualifying rental properties, and properties you're going to move into. What else is interesting? Anybody have any questions on any of this stuff?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Of course. I'm talking about these assignment of contracts.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times there's a lift on it, and the lift is composed of the original deposit paid by the original purchaser, and then there's the profit or the lift they're going to make on the property,
Right.
their thing on it. So let's say they put down 25 grand and the lift is 100,000. And a lot of times what we'll do on these pre-sales is have the buyer pays the seller, or the assignee pays the assignor the lift amount and the deposit directly. So that would be 125,000. If that seller or the assignor is a foreign entity and they grab that money and leave, it's the buyer or the assignee's responsibility to pay the tax on. Is that right?
Yes, it is. So again, that's one of the things when you write an assignment contract, and you guys have a standard one that's in use. There is a clause in there saying, the seller, in fact, is got a warrant and provide a statutory declaration between the lawyers saying that yes, he is a resident of Canada. Otherwise, the same thing applies whether it's a assignment of a contract or whether it's a purchase of a house. If the seller doesn't pay that tax, the buyer is going to pay it.
Yeah,
Which
that's
is, again, an unpleasant surprise for the buyer.
One reason why I want all you guys, when you're acting on behalf of the buyer or the assignee, is that the lift amount or the deposit amount, all that should be paid directly to a lawyer. Like Ken can deal with the forms and the holdback, withholding tax, because we're not, as an office, a brokerage, we're not set up to deal with charging people taxes and figuring out whether they're foreign buyers or not, or foreign entities or not. So I always recommend that on these assignment of contracts that your buyer has a lawyer on their side, and the money's paid to the lawyer, and then the lawyer can pay the other side and make sure that all the taxes are done properly. That sound about right, Ken?
It does. And again, maybe some of you do a lot of this stuff. Like I know Randy and Associates, they do a ton of the pre-sales, and then they do the flipping on the assignments. But if, a lot of realtors we know, they do one assignment every 5 years. And so these are very complicated these assignment contracts. So by all means, feel free to give us a call and we can help you out filling it out and getting the proper clauses in there. And the other thing you want to make sure, again, it depends on the market, and it depends on when the property is going to be sold. Some of these assignments are, most developers won't allow an assignment within 60 days of the closing. So if you haven't assigned it within a particular period of time, they're just going to say, no, you can't assign it. But if you are assigning it, bottom line is, if there is a big lift, there's three options in the assignment contract saying, when you can pay this lift. And bottom line is, what you want to do as a buyer is, so we'll all pay the lift when we close, right? On the closing date. I'll give you your deposit now. Here's your 25, your example, Doug, here's your 25 grand now, but you get the 100 when I buy the property. Because what if the developer doesn't close? And there's some small developers out in the Fraser Valley now that are not closing. We've had a number of cases recently where the client says, well, good, I get my money back, or do I get my money back, or whatever. So the bottom line is, you pay that lift out and the developer doesn't close, you're out of pocket $100,000. Okay, so you bought a contract that went up in smoke. So, will you get your deposit back from the developer? Yes, you will, because there'll either be a deposit protection contract in place, or it'll be in the lawyer's trust account, or a brokerage trust account, that deposit. But your lift is gone. So you definitely don't want to be paying the lift before you close. And that's one of 3 options that you're given in that assignment contract. So and by the way, the anti-flipping rule, the federal anti-flipping tax, which I don't think we mentioned yet, came into effect January last year, not this year, last year, which says if you sell a property within a year, unless you're getting a divorce or you had an illness, or there's 3 or 4 things, I think a job loss, Oh, by the way, lottery win, that's exempt. So if you win a house on a lottery, you can resell it right away and you're exempt from the federal anti-flipping tax. So there are a number of, there's half a dozen exemptions. There's death, divorce, bankruptcy, ill health, job loss, lottery win, change in household membership. So you bought something and your wife had twins, now it's too small. If you're developing the property, that's exempt as well. There's a new category called personal threat. So for some reason you're threatened by someone, you can sell your property and you're exempt from the flipping tax. Foreclosure, that's a funny one. That is actually, I had to laugh when I saw that one as an exemption. If you are getting foreclosed, the chance of you having a profit on that sale is 0. So this is curious. I'm not going to get hit with the anti-flipping tax because I got foreclosed. Okay. All right. Anyway, that's a funny one. If your property is just destroyed or expropriated, again, you're exempt from the tax. So what does that federal anti-flipping tax say? If you buy a property today and you sell it within a year and you don't fall into one of those little exemptions that I've just listed, you are going to pay full income tax on the profit. Okay, so you made 100 grand on your property, you sold it after 6 months, you pay tax on 100 grand. So there's no principal residence exemption. It's not a capital gain. You just pay the tax. Now, here's the funny thing is, let's say you took $100,000 loss after you sold. You think you can write that off? No. So anyway, that's just something to pay attention to. The BC anti-flipping tax, which we can certainly talk about another time if this government gets back in, because if they get in, they will put this anti-flipping tax for sure into force. I doubt whether the Conservatives would, but this one's a 2-year window, not a 1-year window. And as usual, this one is retroactive. So it's retroactive for 2 years. So it comes in January 1 next year, but it applies to any property that was purchased from January 1, 2020, what is next year, 2023. So you bought a property in, middle of 2023 or the end of 2023, it's caught by this tax, which doesn't even exist yet. So anyway, that's, again, it's got a similar list of exemptions, if someone dies or they lose their job, whatever. But the bottom line with these flipping taxes, and this one's a 20% tax. So if you made 100 grand in the first year, you're going to pay the BC government $20,000. Now, there's some exemptions in there that we won't bother talking about because I'm hoping this tax will never see the light of day next year. Because as I say, I suspect if it's different government, you won't see the tax. But the whole point of these extra taxes is just to get a piece of your money. So you get a piece of your money going in, you pay property transfer tax. If it's brand new, you pay GST. But generally speaking, on your principal residence, nobody gets anything on the way out. Okay, because that's, Canadians, that's why I always encourage my clients to buy property. I think it's still a great investment. You guys are all realtors, so fine, great. I think you should still try to sell houses because it's a way for people to store up money, and the rents are ridiculous. So you might as well pay your own mortgage. But the whole point is that governments, both the BC government and the federal government, seem to say, well, that's not good enough. We got you on the way in, but we're not getting you on the way out, and you made some money, and we don't like that. Okay, so we want some. So these taxes, these are insidious because they start off, oh, it's only 1 year. Okay, yeah, well, what happens? Now it's 2 years. Now it's 5 years. Now all of a sudden, guess what? Your principal residence is fully taxable. Really? And you see, we sort of get lulled into this false sense of, oh, well, I guess a year, I can handle that. Same with the BC government. Well, 2 years. Well, who says it's going to stay 2 years? But if they make
how do we stop it?
You vote a different government in.
Okay.
That's really all.
That's why we're all here.
These are political things, guys. I mean, you can do what you like, but bottom line is try and turn out and vote. It's coming up. I mean, here's an interesting stat. 1970, 1995, 71% of people voted in the BC election. Last election in 2020 was 53%. So basically half. Half the people vote, half the people don't. So whoever government gets in is going to get in with the majority of 53%, if assuming we get that high again, 53%, it's 51% of 53%. So this is the thing. People don't vote because of probably two reasons. One, they figure it doesn't make any difference. Whoever gets in, they're all the same. And two, politicians continuously disappoint you. They promise one thing, and then they get in, they do something else. And there's no consequences because we can't really recall them. So I still say, just on balance, and I'm no fan of government. Any of you who've heard of me talk, you know I'm going to have very little use for government. But you should try to vote for the lesser evil, whoever you think that is. Like, they're all bad, but just say the least worst one. That's the one I'm going to vote for. Because otherwise, you know what? They don't care if you don't vote. So let's say only 30% of British Columbians turn out this time. They don't care. So I got 51% of 30. I got 16% of the vote. I'm the government. So it doesn't help you to not vote. So anyway, that's some of these things are political, and it seems the real estate industry, you guys are being targeted more and more and more with stuff. And with more regulations, more things for you guys to be concerned about, apart from actually doing your job, which is buying or selling a house for someone.
Well, it's become a cash cow for the government, Ken, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
And they're just imposing all these things willy-nilly, and there's no rhyme or reason. They just keep sticking more and more on there, and it's getting ridiculous in BC. It's just absolutely out of hand.
Well, it is, and that website is just conservativebc.ca. So if you just click on that, it'll pull up the Conservative Party website and just go. There's a tab that says Our Ideas, and it just sets out all their ideas on real estate, on crime, on everything. So, and there are pretty common sense ideas. This is all the point is, if you don't have an economy, you don't have anything. So somebody has to pay for all these social programs. Somebody has to pay for everything the government does, which just keeps getting bigger and bigger. BC civil service has grown 40% under the NDP government. That's in 7 years, 40%.
Yeah, well, we know all about that through BCFSA.
BCF has a perfect example, but it's everywhere. Everything's growing. So my question would be, are you getting better service then by 40%? No, you're not. You're probably getting worse service. So anyway, the whole point is, guys, I mean, this isn't really a political discussion, but if you can, just vote, because, you know, your vote may make a difference. There's 30,000 realtors in BC. There's actually 15,000 lawyers in BC. And I don't think they're any big fan of the NDP government either, because they're trying to take the Law Society and put it into some government board along with some other stuff and control it that way, as opposed to letting it stay independent. Remember, you guys used to have your own real estate council that would run the realtors a few years back?
Yeah.
Then they got rid of it and put in the BCFSA. They're trying to do the same thing with lawyers.
Well,
so
we'll be doing that with doctors too. We'll all be working for the government soon.
Well, the doctors, the same thing. The Healthcare Professional Act, they've tried to lump all the doctors, nurses, all these healthcare professionals under one group, and really, it's really some draconian legislation there. So there's a lot of really, I think, nefarious things that the NDP government has up their sleeve, not just for realtors, but for lawyers, for healthcare professionals, for all kinds of people. So it's really pretty important that everybody at least try to vote whatever you think is the best party for you.
Yeah, get informed, get on the web and find out some information and vote.
Absolutely.
Well, Ken, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. Guys, we have Ken's going to send me a copy of that, you know, that little cheat sheet on all the taxes. That it's going to keep adding pages to that one too, and we'll get that one out to y'all as well. So look forward into your email next week or two, and we'll send you a copy of that for reference. And as always, give Ken a call if you have some questions about taxes. It is complicated, as you can see. So I absolutely need Ken's help on those kind of things, because I don't have all the answers for the various situations in regarding the taxes. But thanks everybody for coming. We're at 10:59, so we're gonna call it a day. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, guys.
Next meeting we have with Ken will be in-house, so enjoy your fall, guys. Happy hunting.
Thanks, guys.